Good evening. Tonight we're going to be in Psalm 27. Psalm 27. Let's see. Here we go. We're going to be talking about moving from fear to faith. And as we do so, I want to begin with an illustration. Here on the screen is an emperor moth caterpillar. When it begins its change from a caterpillar to a moth, this takes about 10 days, and you'll find it in a cocoon that looks like that. The thing about this cocoon is that it's a little bit difficult to get inside of. The caterpillar, whenever it goes into the cocoon to become a moth, or as some caterpillars do, become a butterfly, it goes through several hours of struggling because there are these thread-like things that impede on its ability to get in. It has to struggle. And then the thing about this cocoon, the thing about this moth is there was once an observer, or at least there's a story of an observer, who noticed that this caterpillar was trying to find its way inside of the cocoon. And he noticed that it was just struggling for no good reason, it assumed. And so he took out a pair of small scissors, cut the threads to allow the caterpillar to go inside of the cocoon. Now the caterpillar was able to easily get inside, but because the threads were cut, the cocoon wasn't able to close securely. And so the result was this caterpillar, after 10 days of supposedly morphing, was able to come out, but still a caterpillar. And because of that, it died. We often think that if we remove the threads, if we remove the struggles in life, that everything will be okay. Rather, we should be recognizing the benefit of struggle. When you consider the caterpillar, it needed to struggle in order to go inside of the cocoon and to come out stronger, to come out in its final form, to come out perfect. The cocoon was absolutely necessary. Maybe it's the case that God allows us to struggle. Maybe it's the case that God wants us to struggle. Perhaps it's for our benefit that God doesn't remove the threads and says, here, push your way through it, but I'm going to help you. Maybe it would have been the case that the caterpillar would have been able to go inside of the cocoon if maybe someone just helped guide it inside. And because of that, it would have been able to live. In James chapter 1, in verses 2 through 4, James said, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Our trials are beneficial to our souls. If anyone knew that trials were beneficial, it'd be David. David struggled with trial after trial after trial. His own son, Absalom, rebelled against him and tried to take his kingdom. His best friend's dad, the former king of Israel, tried to kill him on multiple occasions. David had placed himself in a predicament in which he had the weight of sin upon his shoulders whenever he had Uriah killed and committed that sin with Bathsheba. He understood what it meant to struggle. He understood the hard times of life. But the thing about these trials, these various trials, is that each of these had a basic motivator, and that motivator is fear. It has been said that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. We try to resist fear because we think that if we can resist it, we'll have peace. Because we have to admit that fear steals our peace of mind. It takes away our energy. It deprives us of our confidence. It strips us of our faith. What we want to ask ourselves tonight in looking at Psalm 27 is, how do I move from fear to faith? And I believe in looking at Psalm 27 that we will find our answer. In this psalm, we're going to look at David, and we're going to look at how David helps us to understand how we can move from fear to faith. The first thing we're going to notice from this psalm is David's confidence in God. Look with me in Psalm 27, verses 1 through 6. It begins, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes it is they who stumble and fall. Though an enemy encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. And looking at David's confidence, we know that David is confident because of the different things that he says about God. The first thing that he says about God is that he is my light. Light is a very important term in biblical literature. Light is the first thing that God called into existence. God is light, 1 John 1 and verse 5. Jesus called himself the light, John chapter 8 and verse 12. And we've been called to walk in the light as he is in the light, 1 John 1 and verse 7. Light is incredibly important. Light also is a metaphor used for fellowship. Light is used often in the Bible to speak to fellowship. In Lamentations 3 verses 1 to 3, Jeremiah, the prophet, he said, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven me and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Jeremiah here is comparing darkness to being out of fellowship with God. In Micah chapter 7, in verses 8 and 9, Micah the prophet said, Rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. I will bear the indignation of the Lord, because I have sinned against him. Until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me, he will bring me out to the light. I shall look upon his vindication. Here, Micah makes it clear that while enduring the consequences of his own sins, or of the sins of the people, they are currently sitting in darkness. They're without fellowship with God, but God is going to call them back into that fellowship, to bring them back into the light. David's confidence in God is strong because he knows that he is in fellowship with God. The second term that David uses to describe God is my salvation. My salvation. David served as the second king in Israel. And what that means is that he would have had to been very familiar with the history of Israel. Moses said in Deuteronomy 17 verses 18 and 19, in these laws given about kings, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn the fear of the Lord by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. If this was the case for David, then David would have known very well some of the great salvation occasions in the history of Israel. He would have known that Abraham was delivered by God from Pharaoh. He would have known that Joseph was delivered by God from prison, that Israel was delivered by God from the angel of death, and that Israel was also delivered by God from the Egyptians. He would know very well that Israel was delivered in their conquest in Canaan. It would have been in his mind as he faced troubles, the God that parted the Red Sea is with me. It would have been with him up to this point in his kingship, the memory that it is the God who delivered me against the great Philistine giant that is with me. Why was David confident? Because he had seen God's deliverance in his own life. He had been there. He had witnessed God's power. David is the one who wrote Psalm 124. Psalm 124 goes like this. If it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, when people rose against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive. When their anger was kindled against us, then the flood would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. God is his salvation. Third, God is his stronghold. When you are in David's place and you recognize God as your light and your salvation, it becomes easy to recognize him as your stronghold, your anchor in the time of storm. David is the same person who wrote Psalm 23, a psalm that we're all familiar with. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk in the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and staff, they comfort me. You prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This psalm here, Psalm 23, is a psalm of peace. But it's not a psalm about peace in a time of peace. It's about having peace in the time of storms, in the times of trials, whenever everything against you is stacked up, whenever the enemies surround you. It's a psalm that tells you that you have safety, you have security and protection in the arms of the shepherd. It is not only in Psalm 23 and in Psalm 27 that David goes through the extent of affirming that Jesus or that God is his stronghold. He does so in other places. Psalm 18 verses 2 and 3. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and my horn of salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. David also said in Psalm 59 verses 9 and 10, O my strength, I will watch for you. For you, O God, are my fortress. My God in his steadfast love will meet me. God will let me look in triumph over my enemies. Psalm 9 verses 9 and 10. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in the times of trouble, and those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. David's understanding of his God and his power is what kept him moving from fear to faith. The fourth thing that we see in David's statement of confidence is his desire. Along with knowing that God is his light, his salvation, and his stronghold, David is craving him. He knows that God is his craving. David was the second king, and what that means is that he was not around for the temple. He wasn't there for the temple of Israel to be built. It wouldn't be built until after his death. But we notice from verse 4, where it says, One thing I ask of the Lord that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. David was not concerned with going inside the Holy of Holies and offering a sacrifice to God as would the chief priest. David was concerned, David desired to go face to face with Almighty God in his own dwelling place. David wanted to be like the heroes of faith before him, Enoch, Abraham, and Moses, who were friends of God and were taken to be with God. This was not a desire to see the prosperity of heaven, as some people have. Some people just want to go to heaven because they really want to see if the streets are paved out of gold. They're curious. David's desire was not for prosperity. His desire was for the purpose or the person of heaven. If you don't have the same zeal and desire to see God face to face, and the harsh reality is that you won't. The next thing that we're going to notice from Psalm 27 is David's prayer to God in verses 7 through 12. It reads, Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, Seek my face. My heart says to you, Your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you have been my help. Cast me not off. Forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. The first thing we see in David's prayer is the need for acceptance. The way that we can move from fear to faith is by understanding that we have God's acceptance, but we must, like David, must continually pray for that. Fear comes up in someone's life whenever they're facing a battle and whenever they feel like they're alone. They feel like the world's rejected them, their friends have deserted, their families have turned their backs on them, and because of such, they feel fear. But David said in verse 10, "For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in." The whole world can turn its back on you, and none of that's going to matter as long as you know you have God's acceptance. God has the whole world in His hands, Psalm 95 and verse 4. And the great thing about God's hands is that He will not allow anyone to ever pluck you out from them, John 10 and verse 28. So how do I move from fear to faith? I seek God's acceptance. The next thing is the need to be heard. One of the biggest lies you can tell yourself, which will leave you in fear, is that God does not hear you. In verse 7, David said, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me." David is not saying this because he's hoping that maybe by heaving up a prayer, God might finally give him the attention that he desires. No, David is saying this because he's confident that God is listening to him. David would say in Psalm 6 verses 8 and 9, "Depart from me, you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer." Psalm 18 and verse 6, David said, "In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I cried for help, and He heard me. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer." Psalm 31 and verse 22, "I have said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight, but you have heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cry to you for help." Psalm 34 and verse 6, "This poor man cried and the Lord heard him and saved him out of his troubles." Psalm 40 and verse 1, David again saying, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry." If we desire to move from fear to faith, we've got to understand that our prayers are being heard. The next thing is that we must need guidance. That was David's prayer, to be guided. If you want to put yourself in a predicament in which you will no doubt end up in fear, try to lead yourself. Follow your own desires. In Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, Jeremiah said, "I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself to direct his own steps." Jeremiah 17 and verse 9, he said, "The heart is deceitful above all things." But David makes a plea. David makes a plea in verse 11, "Teach me, O Lord, teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies." David sought the guidance of the Lord. Psalm 37 and verse 23, "The steps of man are established by the Lord when He delights in His way." David knew that each step would be worthless if it wasn't moving in the direction that God intended for him to. David knew that you cannot move from fear to faith if you're not moving with God. The next thing in this prayer is the need for protection. As David is writing this psalm, you have allusions in verses 1 and 2 and verses 11 and 12 to these enemies who are following him, these enemies who are seeking his life. And in verse 12, he prayed, "Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence." David's plea is for protection from God. But understanding that God is his light, his salvation, his stronghold, all of this allows him to know that he's not offering empty prayers, but rather that he is praying to the God of all who hears and works for his holy people. Psalm 34 and verse 9, David said, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." The third section of this psalm that we find is David's belief, David's beliefs. And that's in verses 13 and 14, where he says, "I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. If David is going to move from fear to faith, he must stay motivated. The boxer Muhammad Ali said, "The man who has no imagination has no wings." In other words, if you don't believe you can achieve it, you never will. If you cannot close your eyes and imagine that you are standing there in heaven worshiping God, then chances are you never will. If you cannot close your eyes and imagine the golden crowns being cast at the foot of the throne, you never will. If you cannot imagine hearing the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, I will set you over much, and enter into the joy of your master," you never will. Desire. David had a desire to go and be with God. In Psalm 15 and verse 1, David said, "O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill?" Psalm 63 and verse 1, David said, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Psalm 143 and verse 6, David said, "I stretch out my hand to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land." David believed he would be there. "I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." The next thing that David believed is that he must wait on the Lord. If David is going to move from fear to faith, he must rely on God. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31 says, "But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." That is why David finishes the psalm with the words, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." If you seek to make the step from fear to faith, it all comes down to relying on God. It's not about how much you know about Him. It's not how much you say to Him. It's about how much you trust Him. Wait on the Lord. Psalm 27. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp around me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in His temple. For He will hide me in His shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of His tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in His tents sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make a melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help, cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your ways, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Perhaps you're someone who's struggling with fear. Perhaps it seems like maybe things are stacked up against you. David is a perfect example of someone to follow. David is a great man of faith. He lived a fantastic life, one which I'm thankful to God is recorded in the Scriptures for us, so that we can identify with another man, another human being, and see that we're not too different. We are going to struggle with our faith from time to time. Fear is going to creep in, but the only way that we're going to be able to remove ourselves from fear, to move from fear to faith, is by doing all the same things that David did. You got to have confidence in God, and by having confidence in God, it requires that you acknowledge Him as your light, your salvation, your stronghold, and that you have a desire to be with Him. You got to pray to Him. You have to need to be accepted. You have to need to be heard. You have to need protection from Him. And then you got to believe that you're going to be there, and that it's going to take some trust. It's going to take patience. Move from fear to faith tonight, if that's what you're struggling with. I don't know what you're struggling with, but if that's it, let's knock it out. Let's face it. There's a giant that's looking at us, and that giant is fear. All David had to do was say a prayer to God, and he was able to knock that giant down with one stone. Me and you have the ability to face that giant with the Bible. The Bible has been compared to as a hammer that breaks the rocks. We have a powerful tool that we get to use in our faith. We have a powerful tool that we get to use against Satan whenever he tries to attack us with many different ways. If you're struggling with fear, let's take care of it tonight. Perhaps you have the fear of the change that might come from being a Christian. If you're outside the body of Christ, you might be fearing the change that comes with becoming a Christian. Those things are things that are going to work out themselves. Those things are there's nothing to be afraid of. If you're afraid of coming and getting baptized in front of a bunch of folks, don't worry about it, because everyone else in this room has done it. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's only something to be glad of. And that's to be glad that you're going to receive salvation by doing so. If you have fear in your life, or if you need the prayers of the congregation, I encourage you tonight to come forward, to ask of the congregation for help, for prayers, as together we stand and as we sing.